Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's GRESB webinar, Behind the Meter Power Generation for Data Centers, Tackling a Constrained Grid. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Jensen Hodge. I'm Director of Infrastructure at GRESB and lead the growth of our new data center assessment. Before we get started, I want to point out that we will be taking questions throughout today's webinar in the chat located in the lower right corner of your screen. Toward the end of today's session, we will have a live Q&A. So we encourage you all to ask questions. As a brief introduction to today's topic, we're seeing a moment of extraordinary growth in digital infrastructure. Demand for data centers is accelerating rapidly, driven by cloud services, AI, and the continued expansion of our digital economy. But at the same time, many regions around the world are encountering very real infrastructure constraints, particularly when it comes to power availability, grid interconnection, and transmission capacity. This growing tension between digital growth and energy system limits is forcing the industry to rethink how data centers are planned, powered, and integrated into local communities. One response that's gaining renewed attention is behind the meter power generation, whether through on-site generation, microgrid storage, or hybrid solutions designed to improve reliability while navigating grid constraints. But these solutions also raise important questions. How do operators balance reliability and resilience with sustainability commitments? How do these decisions affect community acceptance and social license to operate? And how are investors evaluating these strategies in an environment where transparency and credible sustainability performance are increasingly expected? These are exactly the type of questions GRESB has been working to address through our data center assessment, which was developed with industry stakeholders to bring greater transparency and comparability to sustainability performance across the sector. As digital infrastructure continues to scale, understanding how companies manage energy, water, climate impact, and community engagement will be increasingly important for both operators and investors. To explore these issues, we're joined today by three excellent panelists who bring complementary perspectives from sustainability consulting, data center operations, and the investor community. First, Joshua Hatch, principal at Brightworks Sustainability. Josh has worked extensively on some of the most pressing sustainability challenges facing technology companies and data centers, including energy efficiency, climate strategy, and transparency. Next, Chris Pennington, who leads energy and sustainability strategy at Iron Mountain Data Centers. Chris focuses on advancing a sustainable digital future and brings deep expertise in global energy procurement, innovative contracting approaches for 24/7 carbon-free energy, and integrating sustainability into data center design and operations. And finally, Colette Lamontagne, Senior Director of Climate and Energy at Ceres, where she works closely with investors on climate and energy issues. Colette brings a valuable investor perspective on emerging technologies, grid modernization, and how capital markets are evaluating sustainability strategies across the data center sector. We're very excited to have all three of their perspectives represented today. With that, let's connect with Josh, who is live from the GTC NVIDIA conference to further introduce our topic for today.
Welcome and thank you, everyone. Josh Hatch from Brightworks Sustainability. Thank you, Jensen. Around here, I think people would think I'm talking to someone else if I was saying thank you, Jensen. But for the point of this call, we have the best one on the phone. So thanks for hosting us. Wanted to chat a little about the context behind the data center community and what's happening with power. Different operators have different development models, but all are facing the same constraints, from hyperscalers to co-location providers to developers. They do things somewhat differently, but they're all facing some of the same challenges in context. Over the last decade, we've all seen the development of renewable energy that's really been put forth in, more so by the technology and data center sector than by any other, which I think is a combination of their rapid growth and power needs, but also their sustainability goals. And if you look at the charts from organizations like, SEBA and the Deal Tracker, really it has been these firms that have driven, much of the clean energy transition of the grid, which has been really exciting to see. And really over the past few decades, the electrical grid has been pretty stable, low load growth for decades essentially. And over the past 5 years, what we kind of had been lulled into a reality there has changed quite quickly. It's not just data centers, but they're a big component of it. Other key factors being electrification of buildings to meet, other decarbonation strategies, and also electrification of vehicles and plugging in your EV when you get home at night. And then, of course, the industrial onshoring of manufacturing, bringing back heavy industry and high tech to the U.S. So there's a lot of things that are kind of converging, but in general, utilities are all of a sudden facing forecasts that are 5 times higher than they were just a few years ago. And data centers, their share of that growth, they're about 4% of total electricity use today, and estimates are they could be 7 to 12% in the next couple of years, which is a really surprising and impressive amount of growth and statistic, and especially considering the context of seeing low to no load growth for many years. So their grid operators are struggling to keep up with this demand for capacity, and they're also dealing with legacy infrastructure and the need for transmission and other grid services upgrades. At the same time, they're still paying for and dealing with resiliency and wildfire and other things that have put stress on their systems. So they're really dealt kind of a tough hand as they're trying to provide clean, reliable power to keep the lights on for us all. They're also shifting. There's a kind of a generational shift from, when we were all growing up, it was fossil fuel base and fossil fuel peak plants. You got base and you got peak, and it's a pretty simple model. And as we've seen renewables flood the grid and batteries to kind of firm more of those, that's changing the equation quite a bit. Renewables now account for about 25% of the total grid capacity, and they're expected to account for 50% by 2030. That's only a couple years away. That's a wild statistic, I think, which is exciting in some ways, but I'm not sure grid utility operators are as excited as they are just stressed about keeping the lights on, keeping power affordable, and what are the level of demand response, firming, batteries, and things that can help them balance the timing of supply and demand. And data centers are massive customers. Many of these developments are hundreds of megawatts, if not an entire gigawatt, which are very big numbers for those of you not familiar, and really on par with the largest of the traditional thermal power plants. One data center, one nuclear plant. I mean, it's really kind of a one-to-one thing. And I think that is what brings us to the behind the meter opportunity, especially with grid constraints that we're seeing. Putting on-site generations behind the meter, co-located with these large loads, has some benefits. It avoids transmission upgrades, for example, that can often take a decade. Although, ultimately data center operators don't want to have their only power behind the meter. They want to be on the grid. The grid provides resiliency and a lot of opportunities for, optimizing across a lot of users and sources. And few energy sources are dense enough to be behind the meter, if you will. Data center sites are big, but, power plants are quite big. Certainly a lot of the renewable energy developments, take quite a bit of land. A gigawatt of solar, for example, is 1,800 panels and dozens of square miles. A gigawatt of wind is 300 commercial turbines and hundreds of square miles. None of that can fit kind of on site behind the fence, behind the meter, but they can fit close by often. But so what can fit kind of on site behind the meter is back to some of the traditional sources and some new sources, things like the small nuclear reactors, fuel cells, gas turbines. They're the things that do take up less space and are under consideration development right now. Although, of course, gas isn't carbon-free. That's, heading backwards from a carbon goals perspective. Fuel cells still don't have a fuel source that's carbon-free at scale. And SMRs really, they keep saying they're close, but, they're not really here today, and they may be in a few years. But we are in this moment of what worries me of a kind of a power at all costs. And there's increasing pushback from communities, from the corporate sustainability goals these companies have set. And I think it's a really challenging moment. I think the sustainability teams and the energy procurement teams at these companies are working as hard as they can to, provide the power to suit the business model. And they're essentially not able, like the progress they've made on renewable energy over the past decade has been really impressive and exciting. And it doesn't seem like it's keeping up with the pace of growth. So it's, where are they going to find the power? What constraints can we put on it? And how can we really ensure that we're planning for long-term, planning for community, planning for carbon, planning for affordability for all customers, a lot of big topics on the table. So it's a complex reality, Jensen. Back to you.
Thanks, Josh. I think you've really positioned us well for further discussion. Before we jump into our panel, I'd like to briefly introduce the GRESB data center assessment, pilot results, current state, and where we are headed. The data center assessment is a new sustainability benchmark developed in partnership with the iMasons Climate Accord, designed specifically for investor-owned data center developers and operators. Historically, data centers have been assessed by GRESB either through real estate or infrastructure frameworks. But the industry told us very clearly that neither of these approaches fully captured the unique characteristics of digital infrastructure and the nuances of what it means to operate or develop a data center sustainably. Data centers combine real estate characteristics like tenancy and lease structures and infrastructure characteristics like output-based performance metrics, such as PUE. They also introduce new sustainability issues, such as grid interconnection, energy procurement, and operational efficiency at scale. Because of this, GRESB and iMasons work together with industry stakeholders to develop a first-of-its-kind sector-specific assessment tailored to data centers. The goal is simple: create a shared language for sustainability performance between investors and operators. To develop the assessment, we conducted a pilot late last year, involving more than 40 organizations across the Americas, Europe, the Middle East, and Asia Pacific. Participants provided feedback through quantitative responses to pilot indicators and one-on-one interviews with investors, managers, and partners. The pilot focused on 5 key questions. Are the proposed issues material to data center sustainability? Are the indicators relevant to those issues? Can companies realistically collect the data? Do managers actually control these outcomes? And should these indicators ultimately be benchmarked? These questions help to ensure the final assessment is practical, decision useful, and aligned with real industry operations. The new assessment itself is structured around 3 components. First is the management section, which evaluates governance, strategy, and transparency, areas that are already familiar from existing GRESB standards. Second is the core section, which is where most of the sector-specific content sits. It includes modules covering topics such as energy use and efficiency, grid interaction, water use, greenhouse gas emissions, health and safety, community engagement, development planning, and materials. And finally, there's an innovation section, which allows participants to showcase emerging practices or technologies that go beyond current market standards. Importantly, the assessment focuses on company-level performance rather than individual assets, enabling benchmarking while maintaining facility-level confidentiality. One of the most valuable aspects of the pilot was the feedback we received from industry participants. 3 major insights stood out. First, dedicated data center developers and operators have distinct needs. Participants highlighted that their priorities differ significantly from diversified real estate or infrastructure managers. Dedicated operators want metrics that reflect data center-specific performance and operational realities. Second is strong consensus on the core sustainability issues that matter most. These include electricity supply and grid interaction, operational energy efficiency, greenhouse gas emissions, water management, community engagement, and health and safety. Participants consistently highlighted that transparency on these issues is directly linked to managing operational risk and protecting investment value. And third, the pilot revealed areas where the industry is still evolving. Topics like behind-the-meter power, embodied carbon, and physical climate risk are clearly important, but participants emphasize that standardization is still developing. The pilot also highlighted an important theme across many indicators: control versus influence. Participants often told us, we can measure these outcomes, but we don't always control them. For example, grid interaction and energy outcomes are heavily shaped by utilities, regulatory frameworks, and regional infrastructure. Similarly, water availability and climate resilience depend heavily on local conditions. This feedback helped us refine the assessment to better recognize shared responsibility across the ecosystem, including utilities, regulators, and customers. It also reinforced the importance of direction of travel indicators rather than overly prescriptive metrics. So why does this assessment matter? For investors, it provides a consistent framework to understand sustainability performance across portfolios. For operators, it offers a credible platform to demonstrate leadership and transparency, identify material sustainability risks, and prioritize mitigation action. And for the broader industry, it creates a common language for sustainability performance in digital infrastructure. That shared language is essential as the sector continues to scale rapidly and attract global capital. The pilot feedback is now informing the development of the first full version of the data center standard and assessment, with a planned launch on June 15th this year and to be available on demand year-round. The objective is to launch an assessment that is robust enough for benchmarking, but flexible enough to reflect the rapidly evolving nature of the digital infrastructure space. The development of the GRESB data center assessment represents a collaborative effort across investors, operators, and industry partners. It reflects a shared recognition that the growth of digital infrastructure must be accompanied by transparent, measurable sustainability performance. By working together, we can create the standards needed to support responsible growth and ensure the data center sector remains both economically resilient and environmentally sustainable. So with that, I'd like to invite our guest speakers to join us and kick off our panel discussion. Colette, Josh, and Chris, thanks again for joining us.
Great to be here.
Thanks, Jensen.
Perfect. Well, I'll start us off with something a little bit more broad, posed to the entire group. Data center demand is accelerating just as grid capacity is tightening in many regions. What's driving this collision between growth and infrastructure constraints? And are you seeing the biggest pressure points today? Whereas maybe it's power availability, interconnection delays, water, land, or maybe community acceptance?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. Thanks, Jensen. Certainly, the access to power is as a data center operator at Iron Mountain Data Centers, we build, own, operate facilities around the world, and so we see consistently the increasing challenge is being just this strategy for how we access power quickly for our sites. Now that'll lead us to this discussion about behind the meter generation, which is really primarily being utilized to solve the principal challenge of when power will be available. So it's not so much a matter of if power is available, but when is what this technology is trying to solve. And so we've seen this before in like the clean energy procurement space, where our local retailers were not providing us with the clean power demands that we had, and so we just started going off and as a data center industry signing more contracts to bring more clean energy onto grids than any other industry has so far. And so we're seeing this now with the power generation side, where because it's very difficult to make $1 billion investment decision on constructing a new data center when the access to power is uncertain, we're just starting to find ways to kind of bypass conventional routes and solve the problem with our own solutions.
Yeah, I'll add that it's interesting. I think that the community concerns are real and are being taken seriously, by a lot of the developers, but they're often, by virtue of where they are, they're local concerns. Right? They're concerned about things that are very local to themselves. When the diesel gens might go on to test, local traffic, local jobs, impacts on local energy or utility rates or water resources, and those are all very real concerns, of course. But of course, data centers, the scale of these facilities will serve hundreds and thousands of miles away. So I think that the community concerns are important, but also a little different than like the broader concerns of, we need to make data centers more sustainable in their operation, and that's going to require power that comes from hundreds of miles away. Obviously, the services are being provided to people around the globe. So they're like balancing like community concerns, which are inherently local for obvious reasons, with the kind of broader systems context of, the clean grid transition, investing in water resources. There's just the scale of the different issues to be considered. So I think, yeah, when you go to a local community, their concerns are important, but the broader system is always the same stuff.
And I'll pick up on that word scale. We've had data centers for a long time. It's not like data centers are new. It's just now how fast they're being built and how huge they are and how much power they need all of a sudden. And, to give you some frame of reference, you can think about, we're talking about hundreds of megawatts of power, sometimes up to 1,000 megawatts of power, 2,000 megawatts of power for one data center. And if you think about it, 5 megawatts is generally about the size of a sports stadium on game day. So when we're talking 2,000 megawatts, the utility, yes, they can and they will provide the transmission and the power, but it's huge, and it's something new for the utilities to deal with. It's something new for the communities to deal with, and it takes time. But the data center industry with the AI race doesn't have time, right? So there's that mismatch.
Thanks, Colette. That comparison is very illuminating. We'll move on to the next question. And this one I'm going to direct to Chris to start us off. When grid access becomes uncertain or delayed, what options do operators realistically have? And why is behind the meter generation increasingly part of that conversation? Are there any trade-offs to consider from your perspective?
Yeah, so thanks. It goes back to what I said earlier in terms of just trying to solve the challenge of uncertainty of when utility supplied power will be available. There's, I would say the majority of at least the peers that I speak with all would say that the preference is to be supplied by the grid. So I think this movement towards on-site generation isn't because it's better. It just solves a very specific challenge. I think generally speaking, on-site power is more likely to be more expensive, less reliable, and more polluting than the power that we get from the grid. Like those are real challenges to try to overcome technically with the right on-site power generation plant. So it is a reaction to a serious problem of availability of confidence for when time will be available now, or when power will be available. Now, are the trade-offs? Sure. These are going to be emissive plants, and we can look for mitigation measures like carbon capture on these natural gas engines and turbines, and we can look for renewable natural gas to help reduce the overall carbon impact. And all of those will be explored. And what we're really talking about today is a relatively short-term problem, I think. And I'll take an optimistic view and say that over time, the grids, utilities, generators, like the whole machine that is the electrical grid that we know today will be able to expand and support the loads as we need it to. But we have to be able to have a solution today while we build the grid that we need for tomorrow, and solving that gap is what on-site generation does. Now, maybe this on-site generation plant becomes part of the solution for that future grid. So maybe it provides grid reliability resources in a much more cost-effective, lower emissive way than the grid would have otherwise had to procure on its own. So while I think initially it's challenging to think about bringing on all this fossil-based generation, I think we have to think holistically and identify the opportunities for where this actually complements this phase of evolution that grids are going through.
Yeah, I agree with that. And thinking about, maybe it takes 7 to 10 years to build that transmission to the data center, but now you have this gas plant. Are you going to just stop using the gas plant? Is there a way that you can, use that gas plant for the grid and maybe shut down and retire some of the really old oil burning or inefficient gas plants, and maybe in the end it ends up being better for emissions? But ideally we'd like to see, obviously, more renewables, but that's not feasible on site, except for, you can have some solar and storage on site, but not enough to power the whole huge data center.
It's an interesting utility perspective, Colette. I wonder if there's any additional insight you can bring from the utility side of things.
Yeah, from the utility side, large loads is not new. They've been dealing with this for a long time. The concept is the same. It's just the scale that's such a big deal. And one of the reasons that it takes so long is supply chain. They need to buy transformers to build out the grid. And those are now taking like 3 to 5 years. just because there's a shortage of them. And so the utility has a hard time buying these, or it takes a long time to buy the transformers. But then you have to consider, if you need to buy that for on-site generation, maybe that's going to be the long pole in your tent too. You have to think about whether that's going to hold it up. But for a grid interconnection, you also have to be in the interconnection queue. So you have to wait your turn. And there are a lot of other projects that are underway that take time. So that is a big mismatch of having to wait your turn in the queue. And it's hard for utilities to plan on what's in the queue, because a lot of projects that say they're coming online and need a certain amount of power, after a couple of years goes by, they never come to fruition. Not just data centers, but other large projects as well. So it's hard for the utility to really know where the load is going to show up, and they're not allowed to proactively build out a lot of infrastructure in the hopes that maybe someone will need that power.
Thanks, Colette. Josh, do you want to chime in on this one? I have another question I can ask you.
Yeah, great comments from Colette and Chris. Yeah, I think that short-term versus long-term, I really appreciated Chris. And yeah, Colette, exactly right. The grid is, a regulated monopoly tool to deliver power and reliability at a low cost. And they're, they can only kind of incrementally do the load they see in front of them. And I think we're in a moment where the growth, as I mentioned earlier in the call, it's the percent per year annual growth is much higher than in the past. So there's kind of a desire to have thinking that's like 5-10 years out and beyond loads that are just immediately in front of them. And I think that there may be, this is like beyond my expertise, but I do feel like there's like a public-private partnership that could be forged there, like some longer term thinking on how could industry help invest in a way that would help the grid get to where we want to be in 5 years. So it's not entirely on the utilities back, because they are investing, but is there better coordination that could be handled to kind of deal with the short term, but also be thinking about the long term in a significant way.
Yeah, that's a good point, because if a data center builds a behind the meter gas plant, then it's just for their use. It's not for the grid's use. And what if the data center, has a lifetime of 40 years, but the gas plant has a lifetime of 60 years? Then it's a stranded asset. How can we think about that ahead of time and find a way that it could be used on the grid later?
Thanks, all. Well, moving on to our next question. This one is directed to you, Josh. As companies add generation or backup capacity to improve reliability, how can they maintain credible sustainability commitments? What does a responsible balance between resilience and decarbonization actually look like?
Yeah, and I think that's the question we're all asking ourselves, and I think what we've seen over the last decade is it's been incredible, the amount of renewable energy development that's been driven by tech firms. And it's, it's not just them, of course, a lot of other companies, people are putting solar on their roofs, et cetera. But large scale solar and wind plants, have been signed in large single user PPAs with many of the large tech firms. So I think we've gotten accustomed to, many of them are already at 100% renewable, at least on an annual basis. And that's not where we stop. There's more work to be done there, but it's a really impressive thing to have accomplished in what really is only 9 years or something. So to now hear that they're actively investing in fossil sources and putting them behind the grid, I think we're kind of trying to reconcile with how does that relate to what you were doing a few years ago, and what is the long term of those? I think they're often framed as a bridging solution.
Yeah.
And I think Chris is probably right that at some level they're the grid of the future probably will have some needs for traditional generation resources, whether it's for grid services, whether it's for peaking. Are batteries better than a gas turbine? Right? I think the wind blows when it blows. Solar produces when it shines. There's some kind of load shifting we can do and demand response that can help, but at some point you need something that's dispatchable even after demand response has gone in. And yeah, like what's the true environmental cost of a battery versus a gas turbine? Like I don't have the answer to that today, but I think historically kind of the knee-jerk response. And again, to Colette's point, like are we sunsetting a coal plant somewhere? Like is it overall reducing the emissions profile of the grid? I think those are all things we're thinking about, especially in this kind of power at all cost moments. but yeah, I think it's tough to think of those things being turned off, but it's an open question to me of what services they provide in the long-term future that I don't think any of us have completely figured out. And I think one thing I keep thinking about, historically data centers have gone kind of in places, cheap land, cheap power, tax benefits, low risk of natural hazards. There was a lot of sense to where some of these large facilities were placed. I don't think it makes sense to have a huge data center in downtown metro, taking up a lot of land, if you want like a walkable community. But we haven't really located them in a power constrained or carbon constrained world sense. And we have found ways to develop renewable energy alongside them, but I do feel like there's an opportunity to look where it's windiest and it's sunniest. It's a lot easier to pull fiber to a location than power lines. Is there a spot that in wind energy, the economics of it, go up with a cubic root of the wind resource? So a site that's a little bit more windy is wildly more economic. So can we find a spot with solar and wind and intentionally co-locate solar, wind, data center, and batteries, bring the network to it, have grid as a resiliency backup? I haven't really seen anyone doing that yet. I'm sure it's being talked about and figured out behind closed doors, but it hasn't been as significant of a siting variable as I think it could be. And also, I think SMRs are a different technology than the ones that we think of from The Simpsons. And if we're going to put highly dense nuclear generation resources anywhere, putting them behind the secure fence in a data center where they're also using a gigawatt of power, it's definitely the place you'd want to think about putting them. I think we're also concerned that while we all know AI is going to be important and change the world, is everyone chasing 100% of a pie? We don't know how big it is, and the risk of us finding out it's 20% smaller than we thought, or basically investing in things that aren't actually needed. Maybe they will be needed long term, but they aren't needed immediately as we thought they were. Transition costs gets put on the ratepayers. The environmental costs of things like carbon and concrete and steel that go into building these facilities. How do we not overinvest? And I think that's something that ultimately it feels like the financial markets need to help us solve, because the companies are chasing returns and the markets seemingly haven't. They seem to believe them so far, and that's above my pay grade to figure out how much of this we need. But there seems to be a risk we're going after too much of it. But yeah, and it does feel like who else would have upgraded the grid is something I also wonder. I don't think utilities are in the position in terms of how they're regulated and operated to be the visionaries of the grid 10 years from now. I do think tech has the money, they have the need, they've got really innovative and smart engineers. Their energy teams are often bigger than the staff on utilities. There's a unique opportunity for them to help solve it. We've seen the last decade of them being a huge force in cleaning the grid. I'd like to keep them focused on that. Let's not solve this by going backwards with carbon emissions. We have the talent to do this.
Chris,
there's a lot you said there, Josh, that I think really hits on the head. There's a lot to unpack there, but one of the things that really struck me is I think one of the concerns that we should have is about overbuilding at this point in time of the grid, because there is under the conventional approach of kind of how the grid expands, it looks at new loads and says, okay, can I support that new load at the worst possible moment on the worst possible day? And so if you build up all of your grid capacity to support the worst possible moment, you've got a tremendous amount of stranded capacity that's sitting out there on the grid. And I think, look, I'm a sustainability guy, so I'm concerned about global emissions, and so don't take this as just like gas solves all problems without creating its own. But I do believe that as we think, we need to be thoughtful about how we expand grids and how we grow our capacity on the grid, so we don't create all this stranded capacity that's very expensive. It's either going to get paid for, it's either going to be kind of wasted capital, if you will, from a large load developer, or it's going to be paid for by all the ratepayers that are connected to that grid. Neither one of those is a good outcome. And I think what we see with on-site generation, which is really a US phenomenon, if you will, the on-site generation from natural gas is enabling growth in large loads in the US in a unique way because we have such strong access to low-priced natural gas. this is not a conversation that the rest of the world is largely having. Like, you wouldn't be talking about a big deployment of on-site generation in Western Europe because gas is just, not viewed as acceptable, as because they have commitments around carbon at a country level that are stronger than our US commitments are. It's also not like secure and reliably priced. So like, these unique attributes enable natural gas on-site generation to fuel, literally, our really rapid load growth, which has all kinds of benefits from a technology and advancement standpoint. It's also actually, I think, enabling us to navigate through how do we keep adding more load without just overbuilding the grid. Not that we could build it fast enough, quite honestly. So I think overbuilding is a concern. In terms of what it means to us, though, as an operator, and I said earlier, I know there's a question that came in, like, how is it really more expensive and less reliable? It is not a preferred solution to have on-site generation, and is more expensive because we have to build a lot of that excess capacity that I just referred to at a very local level. And so if we have a 100 megawatt data center, I got to build a 150 megawatt gas plant because I got to have redundancy built in, and I may only use 5 megawatts for the first half of the year, and maybe I get to 10 megawatts. So there's all this extra capacity that's being built and not utilized. That happens many, many, many times over and over again if we're all doing behind the meter generation, and we're not able to kind of use each other's capacity. This is where the grid adds value. And so that's why I say over time, the lower cost, more reliable solution will be this distributed networked grid that we all need. And that in the short term, we're doing what we have to in order to solve this challenge of like certainty for when power will be available.
I completely agree with that. And I feel like if it's just a temporary solution so that you can get started as soon as possible because of the AI race, but you eventually connect to the grid, well, that becomes a much more efficient solution. And if we can then, build the wind and the solar in large scale and also use all the distributed wind and solar, we can make it a cleaner grid overall. And I don't think we're going to have a lot of stranded assets in terms of the transmission distribution grid because there are so many other sources of load at the moment besides data centers. You see a lot of housing that is now putting in a lot of new housing just because of the housing shortage, and it's being built with heat pumps which use electricity, and you see electrified transportation and also industry moving to more electrification like steel mills. Even without data centers, we've talked about tripling the existing grid by, say, I think 2040. So yeah, if you can bridge that gap and that time issue, then working with the grid, I think, is the more efficient solution overall.
And Chris, I'm glad you brought up that, the time of use kind of component here, because the grid does have tons of capacity during the vast majority of the hours of the year. It's just the more that we can figure out ways to shift load and like that, there's so much capacity that can be unlocked but it takes a lot of smart tech and signaling, but there's a lot of things that, like, you press the button on your dishwasher, you largely want them to be clean 12 hours later, but you don't care when the thing runs. But the technology to scale that up across millions of households is the hard part. But there's massive opportunity to just shift supply and demand around to work within existing generation assets.
Thanks all. Colette, I have a question directed for you. As power constraints reshape data center development, how are investors evaluating companies' sustainability strategies? And what distinguishes organizations that appear to be managing these trade-offs thoughtfully?
Well, I'll go back to that concept of efficiency. Obviously, any company that can be more efficient is going to be more profitable. And, at Ceres, we work with a lot of institutional investors, and we've been hearing a lot about data centers. And these investors are working both with the hyperscalers and the high-tech companies, but also with the electric utility companies, thinking about these issues and asking about, like, what is considered a sustainable data center? What makes it sustainable? What's best in class? And that's changing constantly, right? And they're thinking about what are the bottlenecks and how does that risk my investment? How can we look at minimizing changes in electricity price? Because again, that'll impact the investment. So there's a lot of talk happening and starting to be a lot more engagement. And as far as transparency, any investor will tell you that the more transparent you can be, the better, because it helps them be confident and makes the company more credible, right? And targets are wonderful things. Just what you're talking about before with the GRESB, the GRESB study that's coming out, is to be able to provide a consistent framework for the investors to compare one company to another company, but also consider how some things are different. Like on a facility level, there's a lot of site specific issues. There might be water constraints in that area, so they use a different type of cooling, or vice versa, and that might impact the energy use. So you do need to consider the site specific when you're looking at a facility, but overall you want to be able to see those indicators at the company level that they are working towards sustainability and certain targets and goals that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Josh, Chris, anything to add on this question?
I do think it's challenging today to think about what a sustainable data center really looks like. What does that mean? How do you measure it? And I think the industry's really been kind of trying to feel its way through this for a long time now, but it just seems like it's getting even more and more challenging. I think it used to be a decade ago, 12 years ago, hey, we buy clean power, so therefore we're green. And then what we see now today is that's matured so much, because ultimately the physical data center footprint is going to double in the next 5 years, or somewhere in that order of magnitude. And so the building itself becomes a critical component to how you say this is a sustainable business model. I don't mean sustainable like preserving natural resources as much as sustainable, like we can keep doing this thing, like we can keep growing this way. And so I think for me, like the transition and thinking is more about how do we make sure that we're growing and developing in a way that we can continue growing a decade from now. That is the more sustainable model. One of the ways that we approach it at Iron Mountain Data Centers, we build all new multi-tenant facilities to achieve BREEAM green building certifications. There's a lot that goes into that. So we're making sure that the physical building is more environmentally high performing. That's good. We're also focused on transparency and reporting. And so this is where platforms like GRESB really come in and say, okay, how do we connect the actual performance to the audience? And then the third component for us as a data center business, because we are large energy purchasers, is to support the energy transition. And I used to say support the clean energy transition, but really have two transitions happening now. One, yes, we need to decarbonize. Second, we just need to grow the ability and access to get power. So better buildings because the footprint's getting bigger, transparency with how we're performing, and then supporting the energy transition because we're just such a primary player in that space.
To keep us moving along, sorry, Josh, I'm just going to move on to the next question. We have two more questions before we move on to audience Q&A. This one is directed back to you, Chris. As communities raise more concerns about the local impacts of data centers, especially energy and water use, which we see in the news quite regularly now, how is that shaping development strategies, and what does effective engagement look like to maintain community trust?
Yeah, I say this is and will continue to be a primary focus area that we as an industry need to really figure out great solutions for. We talk oftentimes about like data centers being 4% of the grid's power, or growing to 14%, or whatever the number is. Like we think globally when we talk about data centers and energy use. I'll tell you what though, like communities think locally. And so there are absolutely places around the world where data center energy consumption might be 20, 30, approaching 40% of local energy consumption. That is significant. And we need to recognize that the more that that footprint grows, as I just referred to, the more that we're going to have an increasing presence in local communities. And so I think where we have the opportunity is in the energy space. Certainly, use as little as we can, and I think the industry's done a great job about driving energy efficiency up. But now I think we have this like amazing opportunity to put programs in place that solve two problems. For example, if we as data center operators support programs that put distributed batteries in residents' homes or rooftop solars in the area. We're actually creating capacity on the grid at the point in time where we need it. We're avoiding overbuilding, and we're lowering the energy costs for the people in the communities where we're moving into. So I think we need to, really continue this transition from just being energy buyers to like a part of the fabric of the energy system for the communities in which we're operating. And that's where we're spending our time right now, is just saying, okay, how do we not just go ask the grid to build more capacity so that we can use it? How do we bring solutions that solve that capacity problem and also benefit people with like kitchen table economics type of impact of their local utility bill? How do we help drive progress on that front as well? That's the energy affordability issue is real. And I think we have an opportunity to contribute towards solutions there.
Colette, Josh, any notes on that question?
I think demand response and helping with that is a great idea, and there's huge potential with it across the United States, and we definitely need to work on that because there are a lot of factors and barriers that are preventing us from reaching that potential. Things like just consumer behavior, like knowing when to turn on your dishwasher and what's the best for the grid at any time. Lack of technology, there's a lot of places that don't have the smart meters that you need to be able to have different rates, electric rates, depending on the time of day, and all the software that goes behind it. But that's coming, right? And it's an investment, and it has to be balanced with the affordability of it. But there's a lot of potential there, and I think it's one of the great levers. It's not a silver bullet for data centers, but it's a good way to get started, especially when you're thinking locally, because you won't be able to get enough reduction in demand through those programs, through the residential and commercial customers, to meet the power of a data center. It won't be equal. But if you can think about it across the whole United States, there is a lot of potential there that will help us meet the capacity needs.
And I think fundamentally, the operators, developers of data centers want to come to communities in a way that improves the community. I think that they've had a track. I mean, they want to pay their fair share, whether that's power rates. There's been a lot of investment into communities that's happened. It doesn't create as many jobs as some other industries do. It does create a lot of construction jobs, and those can be a decade long, as different phases build out. But I think we need to help communities and empower them to think. I think there's a lot of like boogeymans around what data centers are going to bring to the community, and there's a little bit of knee-jerk response to like, we think that they should do this, or we think they should do that. Like, I think we need to slow down and have a deeper conversation about long-term infrastructure on water, energy, and community supports, that when they come, it's like a more robust solution of whatever they're investing in the community to provide. I've seen some examples of job training for future jobs in those data centers. But I don't think the answer is baseball fields and barbecues. I think we need to figure out like how to really think about what the impacts are going to be. They're not the only thing driving up energy rates. But yeah, how do we help them think through that together so that they can get what truly kind of helps their community with a new company in town.
Yeah, it definitely takes a conversation with that community. What does that community need?
Staying on this topic of looking forward, Josh, this is actually our last question. We do have a few more minutes. Looking ahead to the next wave of data center growth, what capabilities or governance structures will organizations need to prioritize to ensure both resilience and long-term credibility?
Yeah, and I'm going to go back to Chris's question he asked a few minutes ago of like, what is a sustainable data center? And I think that's the question that needs to be answered. And I think as we've seen in a lot of other spaces, whether it's organic food or whether it's green building, some of us have some kind of, we think we know a little about what makes an organic banana versus a non-organic banana, or we think we know a little bit about what makes a green building versus a regular building. Data centers are kind of an even harder example to know what it is to be a sustainable data center. They're highly technical, very complicated buildings. Those on this call are probably some of the most informed people on data centers, and yet, I think all of us would admit that 80% of data centers we still don't understand. You know, like even the smartest people at this, like the conference I'm at, still don't, like, it's just between network and silicon and power, and they're so complicated. So I don't think we can expect anyone to be able to, you know, go up to someone on the street and ask them what a sustainable data center is. It's not a fair question. So I think that really what's needed is a lot more work in standards and certifications that hopefully make this thing a lot simpler for the, you know, the communities need an answer, investors need an answer, customers need an answer. And I think we've seen a lot of success with green building certification when these buildings are built initially, like Chris mentioning, you know, their company's commitment to BREEAM, LEED, Green Globes, like all those are a great place to start in terms of the initial development. What does it look like in operations? That's where, you know, GRESB plays a much bigger role in evaluating. There's almost no consistent standard for a customer standpoint. Like if you're a big customer of a data center, you're submitting a different survey than every other customer of that data center, and it probably drives people like Chris absolutely batty. You know, we need a kind of a mature ecosystem of standards that are competitive with each other, but that work for the different stakeholders. You know, I think that, and they need to be data center specific because of how different data centers are. You know, LEED does have a data center version. BREEAM has a data center version. I know Green Globes is working on something similar. They are different enough that we need to make them bespoke. We worked a long time in the Infrastructure Masons Climate Accord, building a maturity model. Again, you look at them in Europe, they have tons of regulation, but most of what they're asking for is 100 data points. And I'm really concerned about that. I love the transparency in providing that data, but unless someone is summarizing it, it's just going into a black hole. You know, how can a customer of a data center or a community member know which company is doing a better job if it's not translated into something kind of simple and accessible? Because they're just too complicated, right? We need a scorecard, we need a rating, we need something that helps people, no matter where they're coming from, to decide this is the company I want in my backyard, or this is the company I'm going to hire to do the cloud for my business. Like we need to make it simple for people, because it's even more complicated than the ones we've done in the past, and even those we had to have labels to help people understand.
And I think even understanding what are the things to be worried about are, you know, complicated, and there's so many. And you know, at Ceres we just released a white paper on sustainable data center solutions, and it's white paper. It's not 600 pages long, because we were just starting at the highest level of helping to understand. Well, site it in a good area, or think about water issues, think about energy issues, think about embedded carbon issues. And, you know, so there's a big range to learn from just the initial, what are the big issues, to what are the best case studies.
And what we've seen with certifications, that, you know, generally the goal isn't like who's best, but the more you make it transparent and rigorous, everyone gets better. You know, so it really isn't about which company becomes the most sustainable. It's about making the game fair and obvious to people, so that, and then eventually collaboration happens, right? Because some of these issues are bigger than companies can solve themselves. That's where we need to bring utilities and communities and people into these, like, these kind of frameworks and certifications help point out where the bottlenecks are.
Thanks all. Well, we have about 5 minutes left. So hopefully we can take 1 to 2 questions from our audience. One question that came in early, and I believe this is related to something you'd mentioned, Colette. How easy is it to eventually connect behind the meter power to the grid?
Well, sadly, that's not an easy question to answer. It depends on where it's located and who owns it. You know, if you're in a competitive market in the United States, like one of the ISO RTO regions, then if it's an independent power producer that's building the power plant and owns the power plant and runs it just for the data center, then if they have a generator license, then they can eventually go for a generator interconnection. That can be done. But if the data center owns the generation, they don't have a generator's license, and yeah, that's not easy.
It's definitely complicated. Anytime you connect anything to the grid, it has to be studied. Like, what is the impact of that thing going to be, whether it's more load or more generations? That study process, it is a process. It can happen. It just takes some time.
Yeah,
it's not easy.
So that's why I was saying, think about it before you build it, right? About how it's going to be done.
Yeah.
So there's one more question that came in. I wonder if we can answer it in about 1.5 minutes. I am a student studying finance and real estate, and I want to build a career in commercial real estate development focused on sustainable smart cities. What should I be focusing on right now to position myself as a leader in the sustainability industry? Are there any resources or habits you recommend to stay informed or accelerate that path? It's a complex question.
I think building on Josh's comments, expertise in the frameworks that are out there for how we measure success and how we kind of report on performance, it's a specialty. Like I struggle to know how all these things work, and so I think expertise in the frameworks and the regulatory requirements is valuable.
I think thankfully it does take a village in sustainability. So it you know, back when I started my career, which, you know, there was fewer sustainability jobs. There's a lot more of them now, and they're in areas that I don't understand. You know, there are finance experts on sustainability. There are, you know, engineering experts on sustainability. There are lawyers on sustainability. I mean, it's a good thing, right? But it's almost like you can find it in whatever field you want to go into, and yeah, I think it's a good thing, but it's complicated, right? I heard that question: urban planning, real estate, and finance. Those are 3 different fields.
Well, I think that's all we have time for today. I want to thank you 3, Colette, Josh, Chris, for participating on our panel, and all of our attendees for joining. We'll be sending a recording of the webinar out to everyone who's registered, and we encourage you to stay engaged and reach out to us if you have any questions. Thank you all so much for joining. Have a great rest of your day.